Thank you very much, and I hope you don't mind the switch to English. I should start by thanking the organisers for inviting me here and for putting together this particularly interesting conference. I also appreciate the timing, the scheduling, because I think my paper follows on very well from Professor Sperber's. He spoke about the development of the British Chief Rabbinate, and I want to talk really about how it's functioning essentially in a contemporary setting, how the transition has been made from a 19th century model to a 21st century one. So a striking feature of the debates that are associated, or that have been associated, with appointing a new chief rabbi in Britain at the end of the term of the emeritus chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, also something which featured in the praise and reflection on the outgoing chief rabbi, was a clear sense of the contribution that the role makes to Jewish life both in Britain and more broadly. This broader context functions on both the national and international plane, with the British Chief Rabbinate acquiring a voice and an influence in Jewish communities outside Britain, and in a British context in the wider society beyond the Jewish community. The possibility of abolishing the post and replacing it with some sort of body that could serve in its place was given only the most cursory consideration. This was despite the fact that it was designed under Anglican influences to serve a very different community with markedly different needs. The instinct to retain the post in its current form also ignores the fact that the Chief Rabbinate itself has rather limited real powers, a product of its evolutionary development, as we've heard, rather than being a particularly clearly thought out office from the outset. Moreover, the reality of the British Chief Rabbinate is that notwithstanding the varied types of success, however we may choose to define this notion, that different chief rabbis have enjoyed in Britain, it has also consistently been a cause of division and disagreement, as much a source of controversy as it's been a source for leadership and representation. At the time of Jonathan Sacks' appointment to the British Chief Rabbinate, genuine hope was invested in him and his potential to exert an influence. This showed considerable optimism considering the controversies and growing religious polarization that had characterized British Jewry during the chief rabbinates of his two predecessors, Emanuel Jakobowitz and Israel Brody. Somehow, there appeared in some quarters to be a belief that the new incumbent was an individual who could invigorate the post, bring real leadership to the community, and revitalize British Jewry. In the buzzwords of the time, it was felt that he had the tools to ensure Jewish continuity and the means of securing Jewish grandchildren. The intention of this paper is not to assess the success or otherwise of Sacks' incumbency. The goal, rather, is to consider in broader terms the role of the British Chief Rabbinate in offering a successful model for religious leadership. Relatedly, I want to assess how the Chief Rabbinate can enhance or detract from an incumbent's ability to transmit a religious and moral message. From considering the hope that was invested in Rabbi Sacks at the beginning of his term in office, we can proceed to examine the prestige and authority that he enjoys now in retirement. Arriving in Israel just before Shabbat, I heard how he has been feted in Israel recently. The award he just received from Bar-Ilan is one of a number he's been given, and he's been appointed Professor of Law, Ethics and Bible at King's College London, as well as accepting 2 academic positions in the US at Yeshiva University and New York University. The Covenant and Conversation Trust, named after the weekly Torah commentaries he has previously and continues to produce, was also established at the end of his chief rabbinate as a body that could promote inspirational leadership, develop educational material, and support interfaith understanding. At the end of his term in office, he was honoured with a formal tribute dinner, with the Prince of Wales in attendance, jointly sponsored by the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Leadership Council, the Chief Rabbinate Council, and the United Synagogue. At this dinner, his achievements were praised by no less than 4 British Prime Ministers, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. There was also an immensely popular question and answer evening with the late legendary David Frost, an event that sold out within just 3 days. If we consider some of the views expressed about his chief rabbinate, both during his 22 years in the post and the comments that were subsequently made about his legacy, it's been suggested both that he outgrew his office, acquiring and securing a far broader stage for sharing his ideas, and that the chief rabbinate shackled and limited what he could achieve. The office of chief rabbi in Britain obviously provides a platform. Rightly or wrongly, its incumbent is viewed as the primary religious representative of British Jews. The issue then rests on how best to use the opportunities and limitations that this imposes. A question to consider is whether Sacks made a good career choice in becoming chief rabbi. Did it provide him with additional stages on which to share his ideas than he could have otherwise hoped to access? Could he have acquired the voice and reputation he currently enjoys in a wide variety of circles without having been chief rabbi? The reverse to this question would ask, could he have achieved the prominence he has merely through his scholarship and writings, no matter how prolific? When asked for a personal reflection on the legacy he left at the end of his term in office, Sacks summed it up as, quote, "A community that is able to walk tall. I think we are much more active, exuberant, self-confident than we were." Again, the question here to ask would seem to be whether this required a Sacks chief rabbinate to achieve, and to what extent, in fact, it was the chief rabbinate that contributed to a shift in the nature of Jewish identity that's discernible today. In communities comprised of Jews actively participating in the wider societies in which they're located and actively influenced by those societies, we could ask what role religious leaders can be ascribed for directing and notably influencing the religious lives of individuals in the communities they lead. The evidence for real change and influence brought about by chief rabbis in a British context is certainly one worthy of further questioning. The changes that British Jewry has undergone during the tenure of Rabbi Sacks, during his chief rabbinate, can be identified in a number of ways. In the Jewish Chronicle interview at the end of his period in office, in which Sacks commented on his legacy, he pointed to such things as the public lighting of Hanukkah candles in Trafalgar Square and the creation of a first Jewish community centre in Britain as signs of this new approach to Jewishness in Britain that feels less compelled to hide itself. However, while in some sectors this is playing out in increased Jewish observance, for others, an important component of this new Jewish identity appears to involve a move away from religious constructions of what it means to be a Jew. The scope for constructing cultural forms of Jewish identity has notably been growing in recent years in Britain. The JCC to which Sacks referred is housed in an incredibly impressive, purpose-built building which proudly identifies itself as a space for Jewish engagement. Yet, its attraction derives precisely from the access it offers to a type of Jewishness that circumvents religion, that involves no rabbis, no synagogues, or Jewish ritual, beyond the guarantee that its on-trend restaurant is kosher. The evolution of these changing approaches to British Jewish identity reflect wider shifts in British society. The Victorian-era model of English respectability, which incorporated and built upon a sense of godliness, has long been in retreat as Britain has sought to redefine itself in post-imperialist terms. As a process that developed in earnest during the course of the 20th century, it's acquired different valences during its progress through the early stages of the 21st century. Models of Britishness have come to embody a variety of contrasts. These include space for varied religious identities alongside differences in such things as ethnicity, race, culture, or sexual orientation. Yet, as ongoing debates on the place of religion in Britain have demonstrated, with criticism directed recently at Prime Minister David Cameron for invoking his Christian faith around the time of Easter, the role of religion in Britain is becoming increasingly marginalised. Indeed, between the 2001 to 2011 census, the number of respondents classifying themselves as professing no religion was reported to have increased by 74%. In this context, Sacks can be seen to have achieved notable success on a British stage in carving out for himself a role as a highly respected public spokesperson with an explicitly religious message to impart. This is a message acknowledged by British Prime Ministers, that is given a voice on national radio and television, and that can attract front-page headlines in the national press when, for example, he discusses the role that government can play and encourage the institution of marriage to help build better societies. This profile that Sacks has acquired can be seen as one of the specific contributions he has made to a sense of pride about being overtly Jewish in Britain, which in earlier periods was often markedly absent. Yet, this has to be viewed alongside other broader societal factors for which Sacks can claim no responsibility. It's also worth considering how British Jewry's comfortable settlement in Britain required the arrival and actions of other minority groups to carve out a space in British society for proudly different forms of identity. A type of identity that didn't feel compelled to hide its distinctiveness. More than 300 years after Jewish resettlement in Britain, British Jewry has rather ridden on the coattails of others, particularly minority Asian communities. The explicitly religious nature of this newer Jewish identity is also marginal in a significant sector of British Jewry. A critical distinction emerges here between the public voice Sachs was able to construct, largely through his role as chief rabbi, and the platforms this offered him and gave him access to, and the representative function he was expected to fulfill as a responsibility of his office. On this issue, we encounter one of the fundamental difficulties of the office of chief rabbi, a somewhat inherent blurring of lines between these two functions. Is the role of a chief rabbi that of a public intellectual, transmitting and seeking to teach Jewish values to all those willing to listen, whether they're within or outside the Jewish community, in Britain, or in an age of rapid computer-driven communication anywhere that has access to an internet posting or live web stream? On this latter point, it's worth noting how Rabbi Sachs has embraced modern technology and the opportunities it offers to reach a large audience. Indeed, the last publication he produced in his role as chief rabbi was a digital download, available through the new website he launched upon retiring from the chief rabbinate. The origins of the office of chief rabbi suggest this public role, in fact, is not its primary function. Religious leadership and representation of British Jews was the role for which the chief rabbinate evolved. Yet, during the incumbency of Sachs's predecessor, Emanuel Jakobowicz, particularly during the years of a Thatcherite government, when British churchmen were often felt to be out of step with the policies of the Conservative political party, it was the chief rabbi whose religious message and values often resonated with policymakers. The Hirschian background and theological leanings of Jakobowicz were also relevant here, encouraging him to view the role of Judaism in terms of a mission, functioning as a light unto the nations. In a British context, in which access to real sources of authority inherent to the office of chief rabbi were rather limited, the appeal of turning towards this wider, somewhat prophetic role is clear. Alternative sources of prestige and authority can provide an opportunity to shore up a chief rabbi's leadership. They can inculcate a sense of independence, even if this is unreflective of the terms of the office. What this highlights is one of the deep-rooted structural difficulties of the post. A chief rabbi in Britain is beholden to a multitude of constituencies. The ability to provide leadership appears to be impeded rather than enhanced in these circumstances by the nature of the post. In terms of the laity, the office of chief rabbi is formally funded primarily through the contributions made from synagogue membership fees paid by those British Jews who affiliate with so-called mainstream Orthodox congregations. This sector of British Jewry has been the dominant one throughout the lifespan of the office of chief rabbi. Yet, as the group that represents the middle ground of the community, it is also the one that is experiencing the greatest decline as a consequence of increasing religious polarization. In a British context, this religious polarization has been a product more of a slow process of religious disaffiliation in Britain rather than increasing stringency in religious observance, even if evidence for this in some quarters certainly does also exist. What has emerged consequently are sizable groups both to the religious right and left of the chief rabbinate which prevail and function outside the formal representation provided by the office. Moreover, among those in these cohorts who maintain religious affiliation, there are a variety of alternative religious leadership figures to whom they turn both for guidance and certain forms of representation. This is aside from those British Jews who have moved away simply from all religious affiliation and ascribe limited importance to religious leadership. In a national Jewish community survey carried out last year by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, the sector that identified as traditional was the only one that, according to upbringing, was found to be losing adherents. While 40% of respondents to the survey characterized their upbringing as traditional, only 24% maintained this label. By contrast, the Orthodox grouping stayed constant with 12%, identifying both their upbringing and current religious affiliation in these terms. The Haredi sector grew marginally from 3 to 4%, while the greatest growth occurred among those selecting the classification of secular/cultural, which increased from 15%, who said their upbringing could be characterized in these terms, to 24%, whose current identification fitted this classification. Although in certain respects it's acknowledged that the office of Chief Rabbi makes no claim to represent all these groups, the nature of the Chief Rabbinate is to establish its incumbent as the first port of call for any religious views of British Jewry. In so-called Jewish defense disputes over issues like Shechita or Brit Milah, this can, in certain respects, be viewed positively. Efforts to acknowledge the limits of the representation provided by the Chief Rabbinate have increasingly and repeatedly been made. Nonetheless, the sense that a Chief Rabbi speaks as the religious spokesperson of British Jewry is all too easy to imply and functions consequently as a continuing source of discontent within sectors of the Jewish community. Beyond the laity, there lie a variety of different leadership groups that form contrasting relationships with the Chief Rabbinate. These add additional complicating elements for determining the constituency that any incumbent is expected either to lead or serve. First among these are the lay leaders of British Jewry. This encompasses both those individuals involved in selecting a Chief Rabbi and cooperating with him while he's in the post, as well as those who are in charge of other Jewish institutions in the community, religious or otherwise, whose relationship with the Chief Rabbi can vary. So-called kingmakers, lay leadership figures within mainstream orthodoxy who have taken upon themselves the task of identifying and appointing a Chief Rabbi, have often emerged in the past. In the case of Chief Rabbi Sachs, this caused considerable problems as his key supporter Stanley, now Lord Calms, subsequently came to express his disappointment and publicly called for the resignation of the candidate whose selection he had so strongly supported. While Calms expressed deep satisfaction with the lack of leadership he saw Sachs offering, quote, popularism and survival are not on the agenda of a true leader, end of quote, other lay leadership figures have tended at times to view chief rabbis in terms more merely as a religious functionary. This is something that can inculcate in chief rabbis the instinct to seek authority for their post elsewhere, in an effort to circumvent this treatment and secure some measure of independence. In a different way, this attitude towards chief rabbis as functionaries to be kept in their place is also a feature that can be identified at times in the relationship of the office with the Dayanim of the London Bet Din. Although technically under the control of the chief rabbi, since the 1930s a clear shift towards a sense of its own authority has developed in the Bet Din with great potential for consequent clashes. As the Bet Din have sought to control and determine the religious direction of Orthodox Judaism in Britain, the chief rabbi's role as a public moral figure has acquired greater significance as something of a counterbalance. Yet, the prestige that a chief rabbi can acquire often comes at the expense of the rabbinate. This is something that can be experienced by the mainstream Orthodox rabbinate and rabbis both to the religious left and right, who explicitly reject the authority of the incumbent, yet nonetheless see the office popularly being viewed as representative of British Jewry. One problem with this is that such leadership is reliant on the skills of any individual filling the post, which doesn't offer a sustainable model of leadership. It's also predicated on the imposition of a hierarchical structure whose value is not entirely clear. Navigating through different constituencies, seeking to avoid disputes, let alone providing any sort of real leadership or representation, highlight the inherent contradictions of the office of chief rabbi. Something that it's hard to envisage any individual, no matter how talented, being able to find a path through without critique. Given all the constraints, the largely positive appreciation of the British Chief Rabbinate at the end of Sax's incumbency could be taken to indicate the ongoing benefits of maintaining the office. Yet, this ignores the flaws in the underlying model and the particular strengths that Rabbi Sachs brought to his tenure in the post. The role of apathy in discouraging the search for any changes or alternatives to representation should be acknowledged. Efforts to retain Orthodox hegemony over the community, reflecting an historical reality even if that picture is changing, are also relevant. A lack of confidence in acknowledging, embracing and celebrating the diversity and multiple voices of British Jewry can additionally be seen to be at play. Efforts to perpetuate the impression that a single voice broadly can speak for British Jewry highlight the abiding perception of an apologetic defensive agenda for Jewish community leaders in Britain. This is despite the fact that in certain other respects this position appears to have been overcome. One thing that's clear is that in efforts to examine the British Chief Rabbinate for the insights it could theoretically offer more broadly for approaches to religious leadership and representation, is the importance of retaining a sense of the particularity of the Jewish community in Britain. The evolution of the post in a British context must be examined through the prism of British society, the role of the Church of England, the appeal of umbrella institutions, and the place of hierarchies. The British Chief Rabbinate offers access to a variety of platforms from which an incumbent can express their views. In doing so, views that are not wholly representative come to be promulgated. The problem here is not merely one of denominational representation. A critical consideration is the impact this hierarchical approach has on the scope for individual leadership figures within the community, religious or otherwise, to acquire their own public voices. They are invariably drowned out as the first port of call is the office of Chief Rabbi, by right of the nature of the post. So to conclude, as Chief Rabbi Sachs came to the end of his incumbency, conscious of his approaching freedom from the shackles of his office with its incompatible responsibilities and expectations, his final publication focused on the issue of Jewish engagement with the world. The parting message he sought to convey was summarized in the statement, quote, "In the 21st century, Jews will need the world, and the world will need the Jews. A Judaism unafraid to engage with the intellectual, ethical, political, and personal challenges of our time." End of quote. This position builds on a sense of confidence in what Judaism can offer and gain from engagement with the societies in which it's located. In this sense, it marks a move away from the more apologetic stance that has often characterized British Jewry and reflects some of the changes experienced by the community during his tenure. In certain respects, it's built upon a critique of contemporary Orthodox instincts towards segregation. The question to consider in a British context is what space exists for individual leaders to impart the types of Jewish teaching to which Rabbi Sachs was pointing. For those individuals who lack access to the platforms provided to a chief rabbi, what opportunities exist for greater engagement both on the moral issues of the day and the internal issues of the Jewish community? More to the point, how are such opportunities limited by the very existence of a chief rabbinate? The scope for independent leadership all too often appears to be subsumed under the overarching authority of a chief rabbi to speak for and represent British Jewry. Its contribution to a religiously constructed sense of Jewish identity seems limited. As a model of leadership, it appears to be somewhat flawed.